Welcome. So we have a special guest today and a special co-host today. Giovanni's taking a break while Charlie Morris jumps into his seat, and Charlie works closely with Giovanni. So we're thrilled to have you. And our guest today is Robert Teed. So we'll start quickly with our co-host. Charlie is the practice leader for the Flexible Office Solutions Group at Avis & Young. And at this point has a pretty deep background in Flex. Charlie, I'll let you kind of add to your intro as you wish. And then Robert is currently the founder and chief coaching officer for the Integri Group, but also has a deep background in commercial real estate. And was also, Robert, I didn't actually know this, and I wonder if this was because it was like COVID timing, super involved with Cornet Global, the Northern California chapter, and you just mentioned you're working on a podcast with them. So we are thrilled to have you both on I am thrilled to have you both on the podcast today. So anything either one of you want to add to your intros before we dive in? We'll start with Charlie, because we're really going to dive into Robert's, like, what are you up to, Robert? Charlie, anything you want to add?
Well, first off, thank you for the opportunity to be here, filling in for Giovanni. As you mentioned, practice leader of our flexible solutions team at Avis & Young, providing consultative and transactional services for the occupier, operator, and owner community. I'm very excited to have Robert on today. Even in my legacy background since being in the traditional brokerage world on the tenant rep side, I actually worked with at Liquid Space, and Robert's former company was actually one of our clients. So helped he and his team do various projects around the country. So this is kind of coming back full circle to both of our respective past, Robert. So excited to move forward with today, and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you both for having me. I'm big fans of both of yours. Jamie, the only thing that might have been missed in sort of the intro is I do a bit of strategic advisory work as well that is sort of under the Integri Group umbrella, but it's a little bit separate. So I'm an advisor, for example, for CoDesign, for Liquid Space, for a company called Armor Things. And we'll probably touch on those a little bit as we go through the conversation, but yeah.
Perfect. So I think our kickoff question is, Robert, what are you up to? What are you doing in, the sort of the world of workplace today?
Yeah, well, I've effectively confused the LinkedIn algorithm. I'll tell you that. So what I do these days is I do three things. I do executive coaching, and that's really kind of one-on-one work. And I have a lot of folks that I work with that come out of the real estate and workplace arena that are really trying to think about who they are as a leader and kind of where they want to go next. And as you both know, like the way we work and some of the challenges we're facing as leaders is very different these days. So that's a big part of what I do. The strategic advisory piece, I have been able to sort of take my experience from my corporate life, which I had 3 decades in corporate real estate. That's super painful to say, by the way, but I kind of bill myself as a recovering corporate real estate executive in a lot of the things that I'm doing these days. But I use that persona, the things that I developed as a corporate real estate leader and end user, to work with some of these sort of early stage startups, really helping them understand kind of what are the problems that the corporate real estate executive is trying to solve for. And as you can imagine, those things have changed over the last few years as well. So when I work with like Armored Things, who really specializes in utilization, they have a utilization platform that's pretty amazing, or Liquid Space, which Charlie, you know very well. What I'm really trying to help them do is see the problems that I would have been facing when I was working inside the company, and how do you help? How do you create solutions that are really helpful to that? And then the third piece is I do a little bit of consulting, not a ton, but a little bit of consulting with some folks that I've had some history with, and help them really sort of think about their organizational strategies and how they sort of get ready to change into this next way of working from a workplace perspective. Because again, as you guys know, there's an awful lot of change afoot. That's me.
So in terms of, you have kind of a broad perspective in terms of what people are thinking about right now. And as Charlie mentioned, one of your hashtag on LinkedIn is harnessing next. What does that mean to you right now? And what does that mean to the folks that you're working with?
Yeah, it's when the pandemic sort of started and this idea of future of work started to really come into play, I sort of was getting a little frustrated with this idea that everything that we were talking about, oh, that'll happen in the future. It became really clear to me that whatever was going to happen fairly quickly, and it was going to happen next. And so I got into this place where I was starting to get work with folks to stop thinking about the future and start thinking about what we're going to do next. What's the next step we're going to do? And lo and behold, those that have sort of been too stuck in being future oriented have sort of missed some of their next steps.
Miss the now, yeah.
Miss the now. And so harnessing next is about really this idea of how do we really focus on what comes next and how we harness the power of that opportunity of what comes next. Doesn't mean we shouldn't think about the future. Absolutely, we should. But to be action oriented, we have to then think about, well, what are we going to do next towards that future? And we're in such a period of change that if we aren't really focused on what's the next thing we're going to do, we potentially will miss this huge opportunity that's in front of us, or we'll just go to our default position, which is kind of where we were in 2019. So harnessing next for me is about, let's really harness the power. What next step should we take? Could we take so that we're really, taking advantage of this opportunity that we're in for such change?
Robert, given your roles as a previous CRE exec for multiple different groups, most recently ServiceNow, but I know there's various entities before then, would love to just kind of hear your high level perspective about, if you could go and step back, and I will also give you kudos and your team from ServiceNow, y'all were ahead of the curve. Before COVID, everything that people are now talking about, you were ahead of. But why were you so ahead of the curve? And what do you view as the opportunity for other people in your former role as to what they should be thinking about as it relates to their portfolio strategy in the future? Traditional, flexible, obviously it's going to vary across the board, but what's that right way to approach what that portfolio strategy looks like given your past experiences?
Yeah, so thank you for recognizing that, that we were early to the game. I had the benefit of kind of growing up in software as a service and sort of these companies that migrated to the cloud very early. And this idea that you can do these things as a service and move from, for example, like your data centers move from on-prem to the cloud, it seemed very natural to me that other parts of the business would take a very similar path. Real estate was one that I felt very strongly very early could take a similar path. And it's simply because for all of my career, there's been this huge duration mismatch between what space I need and what visibility I actually have into that space versus what the market will offer me as far as lease term. So I may, and I've worked for these hyper growth startup companies, and I'm lucky if I have a couple quarters worth of visibility into what the business needs. But every landlord in the universe was asking me to sign a 7 to 10 year lease. So right away, there was this weird friction. So, and I looking at again, the software as a service model or some of the cloud data center providers, I knew there had to be a better way. And as some of the co-working really started to take root and companies like WeWork and others were starting to sort of scale, I saw this as an opportunity to fix that sort of duration mismatch. And move into this idea that we could think of space as a service. We could think of it as being a flexible service as well. And this idea that there could be a burst capacity associated with it. So maybe I buy 50 seats, but at some point I might need 75 for a brief period of time. How do I do that? And we were early in that at ServiceNow in that thinking, but we did find that the marketplace was starting to meet us near that. And actually the work, Charlie, we did together was a good example of that. And we were making great progress. I think some of the larger providers were starting to really look at an enterprise product that would do exactly what I was just describing. The meltdown of WeWork, I think, really brought a halt to a lot of that, unfortunately. And everybody sort of, you had a couple other companies sort of melt down around the same time. That put a big pause on our ability to do that. I think the pandemic, however, has refreshed the way we look at that. And it's also made this idea of, flex space, of co-working, just more widely understood and more acceptable. It's when you think of this hybrid approach or remote first approach, or what I always call flexibility and choice, it's pretty natural to sort of assume that space is going to be different. What we need, how we consume it, what the demand looks like is going to be different. And most CFOs, most CHROs totally get that now. They didn't get it before. Now they have a reason to understand it. And so it really positions those that are in the flex on the supply side, whether it's co-working, flex, whatever it is, to really meet the market where it is. And that, whilst I was early into that, I saw that already happening. We had a pause. Now I think we're right there again. And I think this is like that sweet spot. The next couple of years are going to be really, I think, a good run for what you might consider flex or co-working or some version, kind of hybrid version of that.
What do you think, from your perspective, are there still gaps on the supply side? Like you kind of mentioned that WeWork like ground to a halt, which is sort of an indicator that the industry is still really young, right? Yeah. What are the gaps, and do you have an outlook on, what we might see in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think one of the big gaps, and it's closing, but one of the big gaps is the marketplace. So when I look at liquid space, and a little biased because I am an advisor, but when I look at the marketplace for space, I look to somebody like a liquid space to say, okay, great, that's where I go. That's the platform of record where I go to find all this. Unfortunately, not all of the supply side is actually willing to participate in that marketplace. And so that creates this sort of tension or friction for the buyer.
Yeah.
And so I think if and until we have like a true marketplace that is inclusive of most of the supply that's out there, I think it's going to be a little lumpy. The other part is landlords, generally speaking, have been really slow to appreciate the fact that this is the way the world is going to work going forward. And some are stepping into that. And Jamie, I know you know a few that have started to step into that, but on whole, landlords have been sort of reluctant to, they either didn't understand it or reluctant to sort of make that big change. And I think landlords are in the perfect position to at least carve off a portion of their holdings and create a flex product. And whether they hire an operator to run that or they try to do it themselves, where I think the benefit ultimately will come for employers is that'll give us greater sort of geographic distribution. Because right now, if you're in a major market, if you're in New York, you're in San Francisco, you're in Dallas, great. You have no problem finding something. You get out into the second and third tier markets.
I was just thinking about Pleasanton, where you are. I was
right.
like, I wonder if Robert works at home. And then I thought, I wonder what his options are. Probably
there
not
are very
a lot
few.
yet.
Like I have a WeWork 2 cities over.
Yeah.
I have a Regis in town, and I have a sort of a local brand franchise that's in town. None of them are on the liquid space platform, for example. So
yeah,
each one of those, I actually have to go book directly, which doesn't, as a consumer, makes it really difficult. And so if you imagine as an enterprise trying to do that in these second and third tier markets, it's just frustrating. And so I think the marketplace needs to evolve. I think a lot of the landlords are starting to figure this out, like, oh, how do I do this? How can I monetize it? Their underwriting has to change, the capital market, you have to think of the risk profile, everything a little bit different. But this is what the market needs. This is what enterprises are going to demand. And I just don't see landlords sort of missing this opportunity to secure tenants going forward, just because they want to hold on to these 7 and 10 year leases. I do think that community will sort of say, okay, I need to meet the tenants where they are. I need to create a flexible part of my portfolio And I need to probably still continue to have some traditional, spaces. And this idea of burst space I talked about, like with data centers and cloud computing, I think is really important, because if my company's moved into sort of a remote first model and I still have a workspace, I may need space every Tuesday that exceeds what I need the rest of the time. And I want an opportunity to buy that as I need it, not have to sit on it and have it underutilized. And I think landlords can monetize that. I think tenants will pay a premium for that. And I think there's a lot of scenarios where you could see that unfolding over the next couple of years.
This conversation is parlaying with one of the questions I was planning to ask you, which, by the way, for anyone listening, we did not prep him for any of these questions. If you were an owner today looking to go buy and or develop a XYZ size building, whatever that may be, what would your asset management strategy be in terms of like the product that you'd be looking to deliver, how you're going to deploy that, lease it up, market it, et cetera?
Yeah.
What would you do if you're a building owner?
Yeah, but I'll just speak to that sort of generally. I'd probably take a third of that and make it traditional. I'd probably take a third of that and make it pretty flex. And I'd take a third of that and make it sort of amenity burst, shareable in some way. And I think that would cover off a lot of the needs that we're seeing in the marketplace today. So there's still going to need to be this traditional office space type lease product. That I don't think that ever goes to zero. There's obviously a high demand on this flexible third that I would put into that stack. And that's, everything from, you could think of it like a co-working communal type thing to a more flex, isolated or dedicated type of space. And then this burst capacity that I can use for this scenario I used earlier, like every Tuesday, we're going to have everybody gather together because that's important to us as a company. And then the rest of the time, everybody goes and does their own thing. Okay, great. I just need that burst capacity for that period. So that's how I would look at an asset. I'm generalizing an awful lot in that, but that's kind of how I would approach it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And everything you just said there goes against the normal asset management strategy. And I think that's important for owners to know from somebody that has come from the commercial real estate executive role. This is what the world wants. There's demand for a diversity of products out there. And there are ways to monetize it. There are ways to achieve premiums. People are willing to pay for those. So it's a critical point for the ownership world and the investor world, or I'm sorry, the overall capital markets world to understand.
Yeah, I was going to say, and then you have to go to the bank and explain why you're doing 30, 30, 30 and how that works. And it's also such a big shift in terms of like product. It's not I mean, maybe we don't think it's a big shift in terms of like product. Like you talk about traditional lease demand, right? But they want the burst space, or they don't want their own meeting rooms because can't I just use yours, or training rooms or event space, or so they don't want to own things that they're not using all of the time. And maybe they're willing to pay, and they don't want it to be so hard to move in, right? So I think there's probably a lot happening in flex that will translate into making traditional leases having less friction around that process, even if it's a longer term.
Yeah, it is interesting. I totally agree. Like this is from how you sort of fund and sort of the industry that's grown up around asset management and on the landlord side, it's a huge shift. I think it is a big shift. It may not, like you said, it's not a shift in thinking for us, but it's a shift in actually how you secure the funding for all this stuff, et cetera. But it's interesting because when I was at ServiceNow, we did a big project in Hyderabad, and there was 2 or 3 developers that were really focused on creating this burst space with this short-term flex lease. And it simply was a function of the market because so many of their tenants were in these hyper growth modes. And so they just were like, yeah, you need space for 6 months, 3 months, 2 months. It's fitted out, ready to go. You plug in and you go, and it's your space. It's not co-working space. And so I got really used to that model, and it always sort of frustrated me that, and this is before the pandemic, that other markets and other landlords didn't see it the same way. somehow those folks figured out how to monetize it, how to underwrite it, how to fund it, all the stuff that goes into it. But I didn't see that sort of emerge in any other markets. And that one was literally just a function of the demand in the marketplace. Now we've got that demand, I think, all over the place.
Almost
right?
anywhere. Yeah.
But the friction is still in the conversation. So I'm curious, like your role as a CRE executive is still like fairly removed from your former role as a CRE, like removed from those direct conversations with a landlord. Like how long does that have to go on before there's a real shift? The CRE saying, I want to buy this, and the landlord saying, but this is what I sell. I mean, you mentioned like obviously in tech focused markets it's far more advanced, but in others not. Like, yeah, where do you think we are, like in baseball innings? Are we
Well, I think it's early innings. I think this is where somebody like Charlie really adds a lot of value, because for an early part of that, the brokerage community wasn't ready to help that shift happen either. And so if you were to go into the brokerage community in 2017, 18, and you wanted to talk about flex, there wasn't really a conversation to have there. It was hard to find brokers that weren't otherwise boutique specialty brokers to have those discussions. So then folks like Charlie come along and really help that sort of intermediary change, so that the translation that needs to happen from the CRE to the landlord is now happening with somebody that's invested in these alternative, it's probably no longer going to be, but alternative solutions. There's a piece of that. There's also a risk of, and I think this could be a good thing long term, but it's probably a little painful, of this disintermediation that could happen where me as a buyer, I go directly to like a WeWork who's offering an enterprise product and buy directly because they're willing to listen and create a kind of a customized solution for me. That's not able to happen at scale yet. So I think that friction in the conversation where we are right now is you still need to really work with smart, progressive intermediaries. I'd put Charlie in that mix, that can really help translate those conversations. And then over time, as the marketplace matures, there's probably more of a direct purchase, a little bit of a disintermediation that happens. And that's can only happen if and when the supply side is ready to meet the demand side, right? So if and until that happens, that intermediary has to be there. And it leaves tons and tons of rooms for co-working operators as well. Like, I don't think that that threatens that business at all. In fact, I think that actually bolsters the operator model, especially as we think about the geographic spread that we need to achieve for what we're talking about to happen at scale.
What about other service providers? I mean, you just, touched a little bit on sort of the brokerage. What about like the architects, the workplace strategists? Is there like a broad kind of advancement of that thinking, or what do you think it will take for them to, or the broad service providers broadly to kind of, I don't know, sort of be competitive with what the Robert Teeds at ServiceNow are looking for?
Yeah, it is interesting. I've said this, so I advise a company called CoDesign, and their design build firm. And Jamie, you've mentioned their or met their principal. They've really I've helped them in focusing on what I consider sort of upstream thinking relative to this, because I think our entire industry, and this isn't a criticism, it's the way we've been wired for decades and decades, is to think about problems spatially. So we come to, we're growing headcount, our company is excelling, all these great things are happening, and we immediately start to solve those problems spatially. And so the entire industry, A&E, brokers, everybody, CREs even are thinking like, okay, that problem has arisen, I need to solve it spatially. Where we are right now is, I don't think the first solution is spatial. I actually think it's upstream, looking at culture values, ways of working, what's best for employees, all these other things that happen way upstream before we get to the spatial discussion. And so what I've been trying to work with like CoDesign on and others is to say, well, let's figure out how we start the conversations further upstream. And sometimes that might be with the CHRO org. It may be with a completely different organization in a company. Let's figure out these things that are important. And you know what? There may not be a spatial solution that needs to be applied here. If you decide up here that you're a remote first company, maybe there is no space that we need to worry about. It's actually more about changing how we work, how we enable folks to work in a more distributed fashion, work at home, et cetera. If we immediately jump to spatial solutions, we're sort of defaulting to the way we thought about things before. And so everybody that'll listen to me on this one, I've been saying, please, let's not talk about spatial issues yet.
Yeah,
we'll get there. But let's move, what I call moving further to the left. And I have a graphic that I use. It says on the left-hand side is the workforce and the people and the hearts and minds of the people that we're here to serve. And then as you move to the right, you sort of get into the spatial and design build, and you work your way down or work your way over to, what ultimately becomes a physical answer to a problem. But I'm trying to get people to think about spending more time over here before we jump over to the spatial solutions.
It's tricky, right? There's a lot of hardwiring and a lot of incentives lined up with physical space. Where I know, sorry, Charlie, you're nodding your head, but I'm thinking like for co-design to kind of go, you have up that stream that, makes their project further away, unless their workplace strategy, that's what the value they're providing. So
totally. Yeah, I mean, you asked about A&E firms. I mean, every vertical, every sort of service provider within the workplace ecosystem, if you really sort of think about it, has been incented to do something physically. And that's not a bad thing. It's just, that's the way we were hardwired, you use that term, right? Because for decades, that's the system that we've built. And then the system sort of blows up. And so it's sort of, it has to, we've got to give ourselves a little bit of grace. We've got to be able to shift and move upstream. And honestly, I'm seeing some that can't do that. They're really struggling to think about things in different ways. I think Charlie, and you're, in the brokerage community, I see a lot of that. Like, it's harder for folks to go to a client and say, you know what you really don't need here is a space solution. You need a culture solution, or you need a, different solution. That's hard in the way the industry's incented. And so, I don't think everybody's going to make that shift, and we're certainly not all going to make it at one time, but over time, we'll make that enough of that shift where we'll kind of move to the left, and spatial solutions will have their rightful place in the stack. It just won't be the first thing we do.
That is exactly right. And one of the things, I mean, I am one of the rare beasts within a brokerage organization that is willing to acknowledge that our job right now is to focus on people over place, period. Mm-hmm. Every organization is going to be different in terms of how that ultimately needs to be, implemented in terms of any of the actual real estate strategy. Work from home is not going away. Mm-hmm. Traditional is not going away, as you stated earlier. We're focused on that everything in between, mm-hmm. right? And that may vary company to company. And I think there's also, the legacy mindset also exists within said CRE execs, because if all of a sudden, historically, their job has been to understand how to get X number of people into X number of square footage at X price to adhere to corporate guidelines, whatever that may be, that's what they know. So they're having to learn something new every day, and they're being attacked by God knows how many different service providers out there that all have the next thing. And that's the hard part, is how to digest that. And that's going to be one of my other questions, given your roles with the co-designs, the liquid spaces, some of these different prop tech or innovative service providers in different capacities. What is the best way for you to help, whether it's a CRE executive on the occupier side or an owner on the supply side of the business, or a flexible operator on the supply side, who to talk to, how best to integrate all these different things that are out there, because there's so much and it's changing by the day.
It is.
How do you digest that, and what is the right way to approach all this change?
Yeah. I think this is going to sound super simple in the way I say this, and it's not simple, it's really complex. All of us, whether it's the technology layer, the brokerage layer, the landlord, we all have to sort of take it back to what's best for the employee. We have to move into this mode, and you said it, where it's people over place, right? It's this, let's remember that we're building whatever we're doing, even if we're not building anything, it's all about how we enable the employees to do their best work. So if we start with the employee in the center of all of these things, and then work our way out, I think we have a better shot of sort of coalescing around this idea that employees are the center of whatever it is that we're doing. So if you're thinking about, like, how do I deploy some of these technologies? There's a million prop techs that have emerged during the pandemic, all geared towards solving different pieces of the problem. Like, how do I as a CRE figure out which of those shiny objects to purchase? If I say what's best for the way I can enable employees, and I always think about this as employee experience. So through the lens of what does the employee experience, how do we best enable them? That should guide me towards what investments I make, how I coalesce all these different things that are happening. And one of the things that probably has to change on the CRE side is we have to stop thinking of real estate as a finance function, which it's traditionally been, and we've been with the CFO for decades.
Yep.
More of a people-oriented function. And so whether that means we move under the chief people officer or chief human resources officer, or we just develop a really strong dotted line to them, one of those things probably has to happen to move away from it being so metric and financially driven to being one of employee experience. And that's on our side of on the CRE side of the equation.
Right.
And until we sort of get that straight, it's going to be really hard for everybody else in the ecosystem to sort of figure out what we want and need. And that's, I think you're seeing an awful lot of that sort of messiness happening inside companies all over the place, trying to figure out, first of all, who owns this? I mean, if you just think of return to workplace, like, we all figured out how to send people home. That was easy. Getting people back has been really messy, and who owns it, and how do we do it, and where do we do it, when do we do it, and is it an HR function, is it a workplace function? All those different things, you're watching people still figure it out today.
Right.
And so I think that messiness inside companies will continue to confuse the ecosystem that supports them.
There's a lot of stuff I want to go from there. I'm just trying to figure out the.
Wait, I have an intermediate question while you're thinking.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Robert, I'm curious. So I feel like, your background is maybe a little technical, and yet there are a lot of squishy mindset, change management, unwiring things to be done now. Does that have anything to do with your career shift?
Yeah, I'm all squish. So it's interesting. Like, the first 2 decades of my career was all about the built environment. I had this perspective that, if the buildings were happy, the people would be happy in them. And so that first 2 decades, that's where I put all my focus. And the Silicon Valley is sort of littered with really cool workplaces with miserable people in them, right? And so there was an awful lot of, let's build a slide, everybody will be happy. About 10 years ago, I started to shift my perspective pretty rapidly towards this idea of employee experience. And a part of that was I started to get really connected into the CHRO community at the different companies I was working at. So my lens almost immediately, there wasn't like one moment, but it was fairly clear to me kind of when I started to make this shift towards employee experience. And once I made that shift, in work, the built environment became a secondary thing. It became a tool in the toolkit. All my work after that changed completely. And so it brought me to this place where I'm much more focused today on, how do we make sure that anything we're doing enables the best in the person that's doing that work. And so that does bring me into the more squishy work and the leadership coaching and things that I do today. But I have the benefit of having 20 years of, sort of worrying about buildings and the built environment. So I understand enough of that from the technical perspective. So it gives me some context, but really what I care about today is the people that are in the buildings. And that's why I do a lot of culture work and values work and things to really say, that's great. We can putting words on walls is fine, but what do those walls really mean to the people that are working within them? Like, do they even need walls? Let's think more deeply about the humans that we're here to serve.
Yeah.
And just given you went through that internally at ServiceNow and other companies before that, obviously I keep using ServiceNow because that's the one that I knew you from, but you made that transition. Like, what would your advice be in terms of with that change management that is necessary in almost every CRE, exec and working with the finance, HR, et cetera?
Mm-hmm.
What is a realistic timeline framework for how to go do it? Because we know that a lot of legacy, there's a lot of existing inventory out there that people can't dispose of, whether they want to or not necessarily. They have that excess space, but just how do you go about that process of change management, about completely changing that portfolio strategy for the future?
Yeah, I think, well, the first challenge for the CRE is that they're going to continue to be both the sort of advocate for the people and the advocate for the CFO, right? And so there's going to be this blend and this is probably going to be the case forever, where you got to speak both languages. And so if you sort of, as a company, sort of say, okay, this is the way we're going to work, and we're going to go remote first, and we're going to need less portfolio, you have to see that and all the change management that has to happen from the CHRO's lens. Like, there's a lot of hearts and minds that need to change with that. There's probably a lot of support that we need to provide. We've got to retool a lot of our systems, and both like technology systems, but also systems more broadly. How do we reward and recognize employees and all those things? The CRE has to be able to understand that part through the lens of the CHRO, and they have to be able to see it through the lens of the CFO, which is to say, well, if we've got a bunch of excess space, what accounting treatments can I do to do restructure reserves? What can I do to get, shed some of this cost? And so there's going to be this, really interesting CRE, I think, that evolves over time, that's able to straddle both of those. And frankly, I don't think that CRE has existed, those skills have existed as much in the past, because it's predominantly been either been on one side or the other. You've been either a finance sort of oriented CRE or kind of a people-centric oriented CRE. And now you've got to be a hybrid of both, and be able to speak the language of both, and be able to sort of navigate those two lenses in the same conversation, which is, I think that's a great opportunity for CREs to really emerge and step into a function. And I think I've said this in my last podcast with Liquid Space, but this idea that the CRE has moved from the back office to the front pages. I never envisioned in a million years that the conversation we're having right now would be on the minds and tongues and lips of CEOs, right? I mean, some of these things that we're talking about here, CEOs, CFOs, CHROs are having the same discussions. That wasn't the case before.
Yep. And that was one of my other questions I was going to go to. Perfect segue. I'm not here to say one's right or the other. There's office-centric companies, great. There's remote-first companies, great. But and a lot of stuff in between. Who's doing it right from your perspective in terms of even how it's being communicated from now, as you said, the C-suite oftentimes, and that doesn't always directly translate into what's happening with the CREs, but who's doing it right from both perspectives, in your opinion? Because I know you're tracking or reading a lot of the same articles that all of us are.
Yeah, I'll start from kind of the principle of that is those that are sort of really recognizing choice and flexibility as the operating model are the ones that I think are doing it most right. And you can look at, there's a whole list of companies that sort of fit into that, is if they're sort of avoiding prescriptive hybrid and instead sort of saying, we're going to let people figure out how they work best based on the work at hand. Those are the ones that I think that are going to get it the most right for all sorts of reasons. One is, I think that's going to create, the best employee experience possible. I think that's going to create greater retention, less attrition. People are going to feel like they can integrate their work and professional life. So I think those that are kind of starting from that perspective versus something prescriptive are probably going to get it more right. And you can see that. I mean, I think LinkedIn's a good example where they've sort of, they've said, we're going to be very experimental as we go forward with this. Yes, we're going to have kind of a perspective and we're going to try different things, but we're not going to be super prescriptive about it. Salesforce has done something similar. And some of these big companies, when you look at how they've done it at scale, I mean, that's a big risk for them in some ways, right? They have both a lot of real estate holdings and they've got lots of employees that they've got to make sure are productive and supported and serviced and all that stuff. But I think those that are starting from that perspective of choice and flexibility are probably going to get it right. Those that are saying, we're going to give you choice and flexibility, but we're going to prescribe what that means to you, I think are the ones that are going to get it mostly wrong. And then the ones that are just saying no choice and flexibility at all, just go back to the way we were, I think that's a disaster for those companies long term.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different conversations out there around the hybrid, and oftentimes this is being implemented within the office-centric mentality companies. But from your opinion, like what's working, and or a lot of proofs in the pudding that it's not working to the level that people think it's going to. But what is your mindset on the hybrid workplace model? Now, in the future, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's early innings on that. I really wish we would have landed on a different word other than hybrid, but it's sort of, it's there and everybody uses it now.
Yep.
Because I think when you unpack that word, it's not really what we're doing.
Right.
But, I think there's a challenge that I see for hybrid in the way, and again, that word kind of drives me nuts, but in the way we're thinking about hybrid, which is, if we're not careful, we haven't changed a lot of our systems. And I mean that really broadly. Like, if we're still going to reward and recognize and promote people based on their visibility in the physical office, for example, proximity bias is a really big risk. We haven't changed the system that would mitigate that. And so even if you adopt hybrid or choice and flexibility, if you're not changing some of your underlying systems, I think there's a risk that it's going to fail the employees. There's another risk that I really think about a lot, and it's this idea that, and Nick Bloom from Stanford has talked about this in the past. If you guys, either of you, follow his work, it's that if we don't really focus on how to coordinate our time together in a meaningful way, we're going to default to this idea that I'm going to go to the office when Charlie's there, or I'm going to go to the office when Jamie's there. So I'm going to fall into this default position of, really that it's going to be a coordination thing that's going to drive my behavior, not a how I work best thing. And I think there's a real risk in that as well. It's like, well, that means that, I'm going to sort of fall into these behaviors, not based on what's best for me, but just what's best on what's easiest. Right. And I don't think that's long-term. I don't think that's going to be the greatest place for us. I think technology can play a huge role in solving that for us, but I don't know that tech is quite emerged yet. And you're seeing some of that with like Microsoft Viva and some of the other AI that's out there that might say, hey, by the way, Charlie, you and Charlie talk a lot. Have you followed up with him lately? You guys are going to be in the same office next week. Maybe you guys spend some time together.
Yep.
There's some of that's probably coming, and that will help a little bit. But right now, that idea that we just default to these things because it's otherwise too frustrating, I don't think will serve us well, but I think there's a risk of that.
Yeah. And you and I definitely fall in the same camp around the word hybrid. It's one that we somewhat have to use because that's what certain people are using. But Are there any words in particular that you do try to make sure people are thinking about? One of the words that we use is decentralization. That's just a common theme, and that means something different to everybody, right, in terms of how to implement that. But what are some of the things that you would advise people to think about versus using the word hybrid versus some of the other buzzwords that have really emerged during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, decentralization is a great way to think about it. I think distributed sort of fits into that as well.
Yep.
It's not a very sexy word, but it's kind of a practical, like, oh yeah, we're most of our work and our workforce is now distributed. I think that's a good one. I tend to lean into choice and flexibility as a principle, as a way to think about, the employee experience a bit. I lean into that a lot more because I don't think hybrid really captures, for example, the employee experience part of that.
Agreed.
And even decentralized and distributed they're kind of these really tactical terms. They don't really capture the spirit of what we're maybe trying to achieve. But I think those words, sort of matter. And I really wish like we would have all gotten together in March of 2020 and sort of wrote all these words down and
defined on the nomenclature of what we're talking about.
Totally, because we've lost complete control of it as an industry, right? We should have defined our own language and we let it get defined for us. And so now we're stuck with these terms that may not make complete sense.
Right.
But they're going to be around for a while.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's different terms going back to the flex part of this. I mean, there's a different vernacular within the flex industry than there is in the quote traditional CRE industry. And it's just making sure everyone understands what everyone else is talking about, because otherwise people begin to check out if it's something that they don't understand or have heard of before, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Hybrid is one of those for me that has like 10 million different meanings. So if you said, oh, I work hybrid, and you ask 10 people what that means, you'll literally get probably 20 different answers.
Same as flexible.
Yeah. And so it's one of those that it's like, it's hard to have a meaningful discussion and use that term because there's a very high likelihood that we're talking about very different things.
Okay, we have officially run out of time. I have one quick follow-up ending question. Giovanni and I have always asked people, well, in our 8 episodes, what keeps them up at night. We have some leaders that we interview that are great sleepers. And so now we ask, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I love that question because for me, it's easy. It's the work that I do around coaching teams and individuals. I just love that work because there's a lot of it to do. And it's something that I get to see the impact of it, relatively quickly as I'm working with folks. So for me, it's really sort of capturing this place where we are, where hearts and minds are changing. People are thinking about what's important to them. They're thinking about what they want to do with their careers and how their careers sort of fit into their lives in general. And so I get out of bed every morning excited to do that work, and I get to do that type of work every day.
That's awesome. And I'll just give one more quick note to anyone checking in for this podcast. Follow Robert on LinkedIn if you're really interested to kind of see great back and forth between a lot of other thought leaders, change management professionals about the evolution of the space. Great dialogue that goes back and forth. So do yourself a favor. If you're interested in the subject on any level, follow Robert and other people just to learn more about what's going on, change in the industry.
Yeah, I'll stick his LinkedIn link into our show notes. So wherever you're listening to the podcast, you can click on it and give him a follow. Robert, thank you for taking the time to do this today. We really appreciate your perspective and history, and look forward to continued dialogue on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And Charlie, thank you for co-hosting today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm super honored and big fan. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one.